I was pushed aside my entire life because of my perfect golden child sister, and she even tried to hijack my wedding day. Finally, I got my sweet revenge. My parents favored my sister Vanessa from day one, and they never tried to hide it. If she accused me of something, they'd believe her without question and punish me immediately. But when I complained about her behavior, even with clear evidence, they'd barely scold her and somehow find a way to blame me, too. Even on my birthdays, my cake always had to be Vanessa's favorite flavor. I can still taste that sickeningly sweet strawberry frosting I despised. While my parents pretended they had no idea I hated it, they always bought her more presents than me, and took us wherever she wanted to go, even during celebrations that were supposed to be about me. Vanessa grew up entitled and used me as her personal punching bag. When we were younger, she mostly ignored me, but things got dramatically worse during our teenage years. She suddenly found herself friendless. Whether her friends moved away or ditched her because of her nasty attitude, I'll never know since we weren't close. My parents constantly bragged about her so-called achievements but never mentioned any of her problems, while they used my every mistake as dinner table entertainment. Before we continue with today's story, if you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps me keep sharing these inspiring tales that touch your day. Thank you for your support. I only knew about her social struggles because we attended the same high school, and I noticed her sitting alone while I maintained a decent-sized friend group. When Vanessa realized this disparity, she transformed me from her occasional target to someone she needed to destroy at all costs. She started fabricating more accusations against me and my friends. My parents stopped letting me hang out with anyone, making excuses like, "They're bad influences according to your sister," or, "Why are you always trying to escape family time? Why can't you be more like Vanessa and enjoy being with us?" What saved me from complete isolation was my extended family. Most of them lived in our small town of Westbrook, and I got along well with my cousins despite our age differences. At one family gathering, they invited me to join some activity. I don't even remember what it was, and I sadly replied that I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. When asked why, my 12-year-old self bluntly responded, "Because I'm not allowed to have friends since Vanessa doesn't have any." This comment traveled through the family grapevine, and apparently, the adults tore into my parents later that evening. I was severely punished for lying and grounded for a month, but afterward, my parents gave me some leeway, so the temporary suffering was worth it. Vanessa changed schools after that. I guess the humiliation of our extended family knowing about her social status was too much. She demanded to transfer, and my parents immediately obliged despite the financial strain since the new school was further away. She eventually made friends there, but she never returned to ignoring me. Having tasted the power to mess with my life and harboring resentment that I'd exposed her secret, she became relentless. My life remained difficult. Her new friends would visit our house and bully me, which my parents dismissed as harmless teasing. I never invited my own friends over because my parents were terrible hosts, or Vanessa would accuse them of stealing something, and naturally, my parents would believe her without question. Thankfully, I grew closer to my cousins, as my parents never dared to treat family members the way they treated my friends. Then came my first boyfriend, Trevor. I didn't want to bring him to my house, but my parents insisted. During one visit, we were briefly separated when Trevor went to find the bathroom. When he found me again, he looked uncomfortable and told me that Vanessa had cornered him wearing provocative clothing, batting her eyelashes, and telling him how awful I was while suggesting she'd be a much better girlfriend. Trevor was disgusted and immediately came to find me. Of course, Vanessa told my parents a completely different story, that Trevor had aggressively flirted with her, but she naturally refused since she couldn't do that to her sister. Guess who my parents believed? Trevor wasn't perfect, but I trusted his version immediately. I should explain something here. I was a resentful, moody teenager suffering from years of unfair treatment, and I despised my sister as much as she hated me. With that disclaimer, let's talk about appearances. I hadn't mentioned this earlier because it wasn't relevant, but my parents were overweight and showed affection through food, giving extra portions, buying treats, and so on. Vanessa had inherited their build, while I remained naturally slim, partially because my punishments often included being denied snacks and treats. Obviously, weight isn't what defines someone, personality is what matters, but Vanessa was already entitled and manipulative. Even her flirting attempts were clumsy because she'd never had to work for anything. She just demanded, and my parents delivered. Given these factors, plus the fact that she wasn't particularly charming, even my insecure teenage self couldn't believe Trevor would try to cheat on me with her. Nevertheless, my parents forbade me from dating such a horrible boy. I tried maintaining the relationship in secret, but it was too difficult, and we eventually broke up. My second boyfriend faced the same accusations, and again my parents sided with Vanessa. When I pointed out the pattern, they decided I was simply incapable of making good decisions, and kept picking bad boyfriends. That relationship couldn't withstand the Romeo and Juliet dynamic either, and eventually fizzled out. By junior year, I had developed a reputation for making out with boys but refusing to date them, a defense mechanism to avoid bringing anyone home to face Vanessa's sabotage. Thankfully, this reputation never reached my sister or parents. Vanessa did bring one boyfriend home during this time. He was paraded before me with pride, my parents spending every moment telling me how wonderful he was and questioning why I couldn't be more like my sister and find someone similar. Then he suddenly stopped visiting and overnight, he transformed into a manipulative jerk who had taken advantage of Vanessa. So it goes. The unequal treatment continued unabated. Vanessa received more spending money and had much later curfews than I did. When I pointed this out, my parents would claim it was because she's older. But when I reached the same age, I still didn't receive equal privileges. When I reminded them of their earlier justification, they either denied ever saying it or claimed it was because I couldn't be trusted like she was, using Vanessa's accusations against my boyfriends and friends as evidence of my poor judgment. Time marched on and Vanessa's high school graduation arrived. She was accepted into a local college, not particularly prestigious, and without any scholarship. Since my parents only shared their accomplishments with me, I don't know which colleges they applied to, or how many rejected them. I do know her grades were mediocre, as we would throw celebrations whenever she managed to earn a B. I typically received excellent grades, but my parents refused to celebrate, claiming, "Since you always get these, what's there to celebrate?" My parents naturally made a grand production of Vanessa's acceptance and promised to pay for everything. I was relieved she'd be moving out, but it didn't improve my situation much. She still came home every other weekend, and somehow items would mysteriously disappear from my room or other problems would arise to make my life miserable. My strict curfews remained unchanged. Eventually, my mom approached me about my upcoming graduation, as I was only a year younger than Vanessa. She explained that since they were funding Vanessa's college education, they had no money for mine. It would be better for me to start working immediately after graduation and wait until Vanessa finished university to see if they could afford something for me. Oh, and if I decided to stay at home, I'd need to pay for all my personal expenses, part of the utility bills and rent. I pointed out that I could apply for student loans. Mom reluctantly agreed but added that because they cared so much about me and I had such poor judgment, they would decide whether a college was worth going into debt for. I'm not sure how they planned to prevent me from getting loans, but I didn't ask. Scholarships weren't mentioned. They had no idea what my grades were anymore and never believed in my capabilities anyway. I didn't react emotionally. I simply said, "Okay." My mom clearly expected a tantrum and seemed thrown off balance by my calm acceptance. She continued explaining their position with tears in her eyes, perhaps hoping I'd explode so they'd have an excuse to never support my education. Instead, I thanked them for their concern and left it at that. My dad attempted the same conversation later, but I maintained my composure. You see, after a lifetime of their terrible parenting, I had no expectations regarding my education. I knew they would invent some reason not to pay for my college while making my life unbearable. I never believed they would eventually support me if I worked and waited for Vanessa to graduate. I had been preparing for this moment for years. With severely limited social opportunities, I had channeled my energy into studying. I saw college as my only path to freedom, and I worked relentlessly toward that goal. When the time came, my efforts paid off. I earned a full scholarship to a solid state university with a respectable program. Not an Ivy League school or a prestigious medical program, but a quality education that would cost my parents nothing. Knowing Vanessa would try to sabotage this achievement through our parents, I announced my scholarship on social media simultaneously with telling them, even forcing myself to thank them in the post. This way, They couldn't forbid me from accepting without explaining to our extended family why they were preventing their daughter from receiving a free education. Initially, they showed a hint of pride and bragged about my accomplishment. Then, predictably, Vanessa influenced them and they changed tactics. They asked if I was really sure I wanted to go, letting slip that Vanessa wasn't doing well in college, and since she was smarter with better judgment than I would surely struggle even more. I stood my ground. They weren't happy but couldn't do anything to stop me. College became my salvation. I started experiencing genuine happiness for the first time. I maintained minimal contact with my parents and visited during holidays, but since they refused to contribute financially to anything, I could legitimately excuse myself from many visits due to financial constraints. During this period, I avoided introducing any potential partners to them. Meanwhile, Vanessa dropped out of college. I know she never graduated because, again, they would have thrown an extravagant celebration if she had. She moved back home, paying no bills or rent, which was different according to my parents, and started working at the same company as my mom, obviously through nepotism. They presented this as another point of pride. Now the part you've been waiting for. I met my husband Derek during my junior year of college. You know those people who say, if I were in that situation I'd have done something? Derek is the type who actually follows through. I'm naturally conflict avoidant, the kind who becomes a doormat in confrontational situations and then lies awake at night wishing I'd spoken up. I can't help crying when I'm angry. Derek, on the other hand, responds to slights immediately. He loves drama and confrontation. If he doesn't immediately reply to an insult, you should worry because he won't forgive and forget. He's planning something worse as revenge. Derek wanted me to share our story on Reddit and suggested posting in a nuclear revenge community, but decided what we did wasn't quite nuclear. People were often surprised by our relationship, but just because my upbringing made me incapable of standing up for myself doesn't mean I didn't appreciate someone who could. I love that Derek does what I can't, and he treats people well as long as they reciprocate. When we discussed marriage, we agreed that we didn't care much about the ceremony due to our limited budget. We preferred to spend our savings on a dream honeymoon in Italy. Since Derek's family was spread across the country while mine remained concentrated in Westbrook, we decided to hold the wedding there. We weren't living too far away, so we could manage the planning with weekend trips. Plus our work allowed some flexibility to stay in Westbrook when necessary. We sent out engagement announcements and saved the dates for a few months later. At this point, my parents predictably demanded to meet Derek. I wanted to refuse but struggled to find my voice. The distance had softened my memory of how toxic they truly were. When I mentioned this to Derek, he looked like I'd canceled Christmas. He had been eagerly anticipating this meeting, and had even purchased a high-quality voice recorder to hide in his pocket. He was thrilled at the prospect of rejecting Vanessa's inevitable advances, insulting her, and then spreading the recording to my family. So off he went, alone and excited to meet them, returning later in a state of jubilation. Babe, you won't believe the ridiculous things they proposed. We can mess with them so badly. There are so many possibilities. I was confused and wanted to hear the recording, but Derek wisely suggested I listen to his explanation first to avoid misinterpreting the conversation. What happened was this. Instead of Vanessa flirting with him, my parents and sister sat Derek down and, after some complaints about not approving of him due to my poor judgment, announced they were willing to pay for our wedding on one condition: Vanessa would walk down the aisle before me, wearing a wedding dress. Their justification? It wasn't right for a younger sister to marry first, so it was only fair if Vanessa at least had the experience at my venue, with professional photographs in a bridal gown. They even suggested she should have her own cake afterward. Here Derek wants to add his perspective. Hey, revenge-loving husband here. Hell hath no fury like a pro-revenge / instant karma / nuclear revenge lurker whose beloved is being mistreated. That said, as much as my wife paints me as quick-witted, I admit my brain nearly short-circuited when these people legitimately suggested that nonsense as if it were some generous gift. I'd rather welcome the Trojan horse a second time than accept their offer. After my brain rebooted, I had a list of insults ready to unleash, but something whispered in my ear like a devil on my shoulder. String these idiots along. So I said I needed to think about it, see how my then-fiancé would react, and rushed out before I could reveal my devious plans. Back to me. Derek recounted how my parents wanted to make even my wedding about Vanessa, with a huge grin on his face and the recording to prove it. I was shocked. The distance had dulled my memory of their mistreatment, and I'd thought even they wouldn't go this far. Thankfully, Derek's focus on revenge prevented me from spiraling into despair. We had a blast brainstorming ways to get back at them, from outrageously impractical ideas to what seemed feasible. We eventually called Derek's more level-headed brother for input on our plan, which involved giving my family the wrong venue address and other deceptions. The brother, while acknowledging he couldn't talk us out of retaliation, pointed out the logistical challenges of our scheme and the potential legal consequences of some other ideas we'd considered. We ultimately settled on what seemed like the most straightforward approach: pretend to agree but hire security to prevent Vanessa from entering. If that were the whole story, it wouldn't qualify as professional-level revenge. The rest was primarily Derek's doing, though he insists I tell it. He returned to my parents, explaining that he had tested the waters and thought I wouldn't agree to their proposal. However, he personally didn't see the problem, and not wanting to cause family drama, would help them execute their plan. He pointed out that I dislike conflict, so if they surprised me with this arrangement on the wedding day, I might not make a scene in front of all our guests. On the other hand, marriage is significant, so who could predict how I'd react? Derek then suggested a compromise. If they helped pay for the wedding, I would feel additional pressure not to object, since we'd be both in public with our families and grateful for their financial assistance. According to Derek, my parents looked stunned, and my adult sister literally started skipping with joy like a child. The deal was struck. Importantly, Derek also claimed that due to some bad judgment with past boyfriends, I'm immensely proud of how he used their words against them. I was distrustful and controlling, frequently checking his phone for evidence of cheating. Therefore, it was essential that nothing about this plan ever appear in writing. For any discussions regarding Vanessa walking down the aisle before me, he would visit their house in person. Thus began months of deception, during which my parents and sister believed they were tricking me, while Derek and I methodically exploited them. Rather than simply paying for the wedding, they were unknowingly funding an increasingly extravagant affair. My parents naturally wanted input on everything, including elements that mattered deeply to me like the music selection and color scheme. Derek would convince them to back off on those details to keep me compliant, but since we never really cared about the ceremony itself, everything else was fair game, or so they thought. Here's how we operated. We'd review drink and menu options, then select the lowest or second lowest priced items. Derek would then secretly take Vanessa to taste them and sigh regretfully, saying, "It's such a shame we don't want to take advantage of your parents' generosity, so we can't get the premium options." Cue Vanessa demanding that my parents pay for the most expensive choices. My parents would then assure me not to worry, offering to cover the cost of the highest tier selections. We repeated this strategy with the photographer, flowers, venue decorations, everything. Derek would show Vanessa the elegant flowers we'd chosen, then lament how I wanted some gaudy, tasteless arrangement instead. My parents would then tell me they preferred the original flowers and would pay for them. We encountered a minor obstacle regarding the wedding dress. My parents wanted me to wear a hideous gown, well, not completely hideous but definitely not my style and unflattering for my body type. We had planned to agree verbally and then simply not use it, but my mom texted me about it, creating written evidence. I had to stand firm and refused to reply by text. Derek visited them and said he'd see what he could do. Vanessa suggested sabotaging my preferred dress, so I'd be forced to wear their selection. He pretended to agree. Throughout this process, they avoided written communication about their scheme. We ensured this by having me immediately respond whenever Vanessa tried messaging Derek directly. This reinforced his claims about my jealous, controlling nature, so they believed it and never risked putting anything in writing. Some might find it uncomfortable for their partner to speak negatively about them to family, but I'm such a pushover that I found it hilarious to be portrayed as this dangerous, controlling person. I encouraged Derek to embellish the characterization, perhaps revealing my warped sense of humor. And yes, Vanessa did attempt to flirt with Derek, but he acted conflicted to sell the narrative that he was on their side. He pretended to share information with them without my knowledge, though he never revealed that we had hired security. The irony wasn't lost on us. Derek and I, who had seriously considered a courthouse wedding to maximize our honeymoon budget, ended up with this elaborate, expensive celebration while barely spending anything ourselves. We justified it as compensation for emotional damages inflicted by my parents over the years. I think Derek, he just confirmed I'm right, enjoyed orchestrating this deception more than planning our actual wedding. I never imagined witnessing my fiancé beam with excitement at the prospect of spending entire Saturdays driving back and forth to discuss wedding details with his future in-laws. But there we were. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The plan my parents, sister, and Derek had concocted was to wait until all guests were seated, since the bride typically arrives late. Vanessa would appear at precisely that moment to avoid me seeing her and attempting to intervene. She would walk down the aisle, and by the time I learned what had happened, it would be too late to object. Regarding my dress, we had saved fabric scraps from my alterations. Derek took these to my parents' house, Vanessa still lives with them, as proof he had damaged my dress, then claimed he needed to return to me immediately as I was having a meltdown, and he needed to calm me down. He told them he'd see them at the wedding. We kept our real security personnel hidden initially. As guests and my parents arrived, they only saw a woman checking names against a list. Only after my parents were seated did we bring out the actual security man who resembled a professional bodyguard. We instructed him to prevent Vanessa from entering and promised a generous tip if he followed our instructions discreetly. Then came the critical moment. My parents received a text that Vanessa was less than 5 minutes away, so my dad signaled for the ceremony to begin. My bridesmaids, who had been instructed to follow his cue without checking with me, took their positions. My dad stood at the entrance waiting for me to appear. During this time, a friend who wasn't in the wedding party texted me to prepare. To avoid suspicion, we had this friend, not my husband or bridesmaids, communicate with me. She was as eager for drama as Derek and didn't mind not being a bridesmaid. As soon as my dad took his position, the bridal march began. The doors opened and I entered. My dad looked shocked to see me. He tried to look behind me but couldn't see the venue entrance from where we stood, so he had no idea what had happened to Vanessa. Then his phone rang. I saw the caller ID was my sister. He abruptly left me with a mumbled, "Something came up." Gasps and confused murmurs filled the room. My friend loudly asked what had happened. I tearfully lied. He told me it wasn't supposed to be me walking down the aisle. Derek and I had agreed that if my dad abandoned me, I should say this to make him look as terrible as possible. The tears weren't entirely acting. I was genuinely hurt and fighting back stronger emotions. My friend then loudly asked, "What did he mean by it shouldn't be you?" Ensuring everyone could hear and spread the information. Then she announced, "I'll go check," and ran off. We had planned this so she could create chaos at the entrance and prevent my dad from returning to interrupt the ceremony. Eventually, my mom also left. At this point, Derek's father quickly approached and took my arm. He'd been forewarned he might need to step in. His urgent dash to my side made me smile through my tears. I proceeded down the aisle amid whispers as guests discussed the unfolding drama. Some left to investigate as well. When I reached Derek, he comforted me, joking that my sad expression was so convincing I deserved an Oscar, and reassured me he would handle my parents' behavior. We completed the ceremony without further disruptions. My parents never returned. I noticed many guests leaving and returning during the reception, but no one dared tell me what was happening. Someone whispered in Derek's ear, and he stepped outside. He returned later with a thunderous expression but whispered to me that he needed to hide before he broke character and started laughing. It worked perfectly. Here's what happened outside. As later reported by friends, family, the security guard, and Derek. Vanessa arrived wearing a wedding dress. The security guard refused to let her enter as instructed, telling her she must be at the wrong venue because there was already a bride inside. Yes, we tipped him extremely well as promised. My dad threatened to call the police, claiming he'd never seen this security person before, so he couldn't possibly be working at our wedding. The guard calmly agreed to contact the authorities since he was legitimately hired by us and was simply doing his job. My dad realized this would take too long and demanded they let Vanessa in immediately. At this point, my friend arrived, started shouting and questioning what was happening, effectively stalling for time. My mom soon appeared, followed by other curious guests. By then, their scheme was thoroughly exposed. All my parents could do was damage control, as everyone who discovered their plan was horrified they'd attempt such a thing. People began berating them loudly. The three naturally claimed it wasn't a secret and blamed Derek. When he was summoned, Derek put on his most bewildered expression and denied everything. To quote him directly, "Gaslight, gatekeep, girlboss, lol." He adamantly denied ever agreeing to such a ridiculous arrangement. When they insisted he demanded proof, which of course they couldn't provide. All the text exchanges they could show were about normal wedding decisions. Vanessa was screaming, crying, and apparently sat on the ground, kicking her legs like a toddler. My dad looked ready to physically attack Derek, but security and other guests restrained him. Predictably, they claimed they had no evidence because Derek had instructed them not to text about it. Derek laughed and said, "How convenient, right?" Then he asked rhetorically, "Why would I ever agree to something so messed up?" He criticized them for being terrible parents and declared he wouldn't let their stupid plans and lies ruin our wedding, then returned to me. No one believed them. The venue had security cameras, but they wouldn't share the footage with us as it was for security purposes only. However, some guests recorded parts of the confrontation. Watching my parents and sister being publicly called out by everyone who witnessed the drama was delicious. After years of being falsely accused and disbelieved, seeing them get a taste of their own medicine was one of the best wedding gifts I could have received. My mother wept, my father's face alternated between purple rage and pale shock, and Vanessa remained on the floor, wailing and screaming. They kept insisting Derek was complicit, but people repeatedly asked why he would agree to such a scheme, why there was no evidence, and why they wanted Vanessa to hijack my wedding in the first place. They had no satisfactory answers. Eventually, they were asked to leave and had no choice but to comply. My dad apparently had to physically lift Vanessa from the ground as she refused to stand. Remarkably, no one mentioned any of this to me during the reception. I suspect they wanted to spare my feelings, and perhaps being the bride, rather than just another family member, meant everyone made an extra effort to be positive and enthusiastic about everything. Derek says the expensive food and abundant drinks certainly helped maintain the festive atmosphere. We had an amazing time. Derek maintained his angry facade for only a brief period before breaking into a genuine smile. Afterward, we retreated to our hotel to rest before departing for our honeymoon the next morning. Speaking of which, my parents did attempt to pay for our plane tickets, but we suspected they might try to cancel them or create other problems, so we declined. Since then, all three have tried to contact me. I've refused their calls because Derek insisted on maintaining a paper trail. A wise decision, as Vanessa eventually sent me a message. I won't repeat her exact words as they were unhinged and largely incoherent, but essentially, she blamed me for her humiliation, called Derek a two-faced snake who fooled them for months. He wants to frame and hang that particular phrase on our wall, and expressed both hope and certainty that he would cheat on me. She even suggested he was already cheating with her. Derek took my phone, screenshot the call logs, Vanessa's messages, and communications from my parents demanding I answer their calls. He sent everything to our extended family group chat, along with screenshots of messages they had sent him containing insults and threats. He maintained his "you're delusional, I never agreed to anything" stance and even threatened to sue them for defamation and harassment. He wrote a message in the group chat pleading with my family for help, saying I was being constantly harassed by them after they failed to ruin our wedding. He begged them to intervene and prevent my parents from sharing our location, lest they send Vanessa to our honeymoon destination, claiming Derek had somehow agreed to pretend to sleep with her in our suite. His sense of humor is something else. My extended family assured him they would handle the situation, and since then we've had peace. Derek is slightly disappointed that Vanessa hasn't disobeyed, as he was looking forward to confronting her again. We'll see if the tranquility lasts. Overall, while I would have preferred having a normal, loving family at my wedding, at least for once in my life, they not only failed to ruin something meaningful to me, but I finally got my revenge. People often ask why my parents treated me this way. I've pondered this my entire life and still don't have a definitive answer. I tried asking when I was younger, but they denied any differential treatment and scolded me for being spoiled. So I stopped inquiring. I've considered many possibilities, but based on my observations, I believe I was an unplanned pregnancy. They struggled to conceive Vanessa, so she was not only wanted but also considered their miracle child. However, given our small age difference, I think they didn't expect to have another baby so soon or easily and failed to use adequate contraception after Vanessa's birth. Perhaps they didn't realize my mother was pregnant until it was too late, so they were burdened with an unexpected child while still adjusting to their first baby. They weren't financially comfortable, so the additional expense likely exacerbated their resentment. But that's just speculation. I've accepted that the reason doesn't truly matter. Their treatment of me was unjustifiable regardless of the circumstances. Did they really think their wedding plan would work? Derek and I have a theory that they never actually intended to go through with it. We suspect Vanessa threw a tantrum about me getting married first when she barely gets dates, and they made that outlandish proposition to Derek as a result. They didn't want to contribute financially to my wedding, and didn't expect us to accept such ridiculous terms. By offering and being refused, they could appear supportive to Vanessa while having an excuse not to spend money on me. But then Derek accepted, and they couldn't back out without risking Vanessa's wrath. In the end, justice was served in the most public, satisfying way possible. And every time I look at our wedding photos, which turned out beautifully by the way, I can't help but smile at how their plan backfired so spectacularly.